Hello everyone and good evening. I'm James Harding. I'm the co-founder of Tortoise, and I'm going to give you an embarrassing glimpse into how journalism works. In the last 3 weeks, maybe, I've heard the following things. I was involved in a conversation where Mark Walpert, who used to run Welcome, was alongside Nadeem Zahawi and Matthew Gould, who now runs the sort of digital side of the NHS, NHSX. And we were talking about future pandemics. And Matthew Gould said, actually, if you were to try and rank all of the future threats that disrupt the NHS, the number one at the top of it would be cyber. Because the one thing you know is that there will be some kind of chronic outage at an NHS hospital at some point in the not too distant future. Other threats you can't tell, you can't guarantee whether they'll happen, but this one you can guarantee will. And then I was on a call with Jesse Norman, who is now in the Treasury Minister, who said, if you think the last decade has been about the internet's disruption to content and harms online that are about the way in which our culture works, the next decade is going to be about harms online to the economy. They're going to hit you in your pocket, and they're going to be to businesses and us as individuals, economic harms online. And then over the weekend, I was talking to someone who said out of the blue, I said, oh, how's so-and-so? Kind of not quite a mutual friend, but someone that we know in common. Oh, she said she's had a terrible time. She's had a ransomware attack. And this is on someone who's got a business that is a kind of not very well-known name, fashionable, but small. And the ransomware attack was deemed as a huge headache, but the cost of doing business. And so here's my embarrassing confession about how journalism works. From these three entirely random points of information, I, as a reporter, detect an enormous trend. Something big is happening. And before we got on the call, I was saying to Kieran, Martina, and Dave, I have this sense that even bigger than health, bigger than climate, cyber is going to surprise us in terms of the scale of disruption and what it means to our everyday lives and our business lives. So with that as a backdrop to the conversation we're about to have, we're trying to map out how, as a newsroom, we report out, investigate out what's happening in the darker corners of the internet. We're preparing for the autumn a series of these think-ins on what we're calling the rogue states of the internet. And we're extremely grateful that Kieran Martin, Dave Palmer, and Martina King are here, but we're also extremely grateful to all of you for joining us, because the one thing I should say, if you've never been to a think-in before, the idea is it's basically like an open news meeting. Actually, Dave Palmer from Darktrace was kind enough to come back in the day that we were all holding them in our newsroom. Do you remember, Dave? I think we even served you a glass of wine in those happy days. I'm afraid you don't get that now. And what I hope we can do is understand the accelerating trend around cyber, but also what the responsibility is in terms of responding to it. And what that means is, please, if you've got an experience, if you've got a point of view, weigh in the chat or message me. I'll bring you into the conversation. But I'm going to, and what I hope is, in the course, I'll come to Martin and Dave, but I'm going to start, if I might, with Kieran Martin. Kieran, as many of you who know anything about this area will know, is in many ways the dawn of cybercrime in this country. I'm not sure that's the right phrase, is it, Kieran, because you're on the other side of it.
Well, I try and prevent it, but
prevent it, exactly. But you were the founding chief
executive
of the National Cybersecurity Centre. So I wondered whether you can. Will you take, I wanted to start, if we could, by taking some specific examples. And I don't know whether you saw in the slides, we took that co-op example in Sweden. And there's a growing attention now around Reval. Do you want to take that as a start and just say what that's telling us about the way cybercrime is developing?
So, and there's a really serious point you mentioned about, media, and you're thinking about how to report it. And actually, I think that's a really good thing, because, just before we started, I was looking at social media, and one of my friends posted this thing from CNN, so a really major, respected global news organization. And it's got a picture of some fighter planes, and one of them appears to be falling out of the sky. And this is CNN today, and the headline says, something like World War III could be a cyber war, experts say. And this is absolute nonsense. What we're actually talking about is the sort of harm that was on the slide. We're talking about Sweden at the weekend. So for those of you who haven't been following, the delights of Revil, which is a Russian group of cyber criminals who liked playing Resident Evil. This is their own words to journalists. So they call themselves Revil, and they're not directed by the Russian state, but they sit there because it's a safe environment for them, and they hack away. And they're getting a bit cocky. So they got $11 million out of a meat company last month by ransoming them, and they paid. So what they've done this time is, and Dave and Martina probably have better sort of expert insights than me. But Revil have attacked a company called Kaseya. Now, probably not heard of Kaseya either. They're a competitor of a company you may have heard of, but you may not have heard of until recently, called SolarWinds. So they're a big sort of, remote network support based. Actually, they're headquartered in Dublin, but they're mostly in the US. And so Revil decide they're going to hack them. Now, normally when you do one of these ransomware attacks, as your story implied, James, it's an A to B thing, right? I'm Revil, I'm A, and you, James, you're B, and I'm going to attack you, and I'm going to extort you for money, and you're not going to get your network back until I'm done. But because it was Kaseya, they're a sort of, fundamental cog in the supply chain of global network technology. So if you use them, or if you use somebody who used them, you could be at risk. So the harm caused by this attack manifests itself in really, really weird places, including Swedish co-ops. So the Swedish cooperative network is not even a customer of Kaseya, but they use technology for processing digital payments, which draws on Kaseya technology. And Sweden is a largely cashless society. In fact, I think it's due to be fully cashless by 2023 or 2024. They couldn't sell anything in about 500 of their 800 shops. And, this is pretty serious, because I'm told, one of those facts that I didn't know until this weekend, that the co-op provides 20% of Swedish physical food retail capacity, and a disproportionate amount of that is in smaller towns and villages where it's the only food store in town. So, on Sunday, you saw pictures on TV news and on social media of Swedish co-op staff just giving away perishable food, strawberries and other fruits and all the other stuff that will go off because they couldn't sell it. Similarly, some schools were badly affected in New Zealand, so another, relatively sleepy, prosperous country at the other side of the earth. And then today, as America got back to work after the 4th of July public holiday weekend, small organizations are just finding themselves in really, really difficult situations. So, I won't go on, but this shows us, intrinsic vulnerability of supply chain, sheer malevolence of criminals, and much else.
Let's understand a couple of things. So Revil are not state actors, but they're hosted by Russia. Is that the idea?
Well, they're based in Russia. I mean, put it this way, and your other panelists and audience will have a view on this. I can't think of an equivalent to Revil in the United Kingdom, the United States, anywhere in the European Union, because policing would just kick down the door eventually. It's quite hard to hide. I mean, they're a massive bunch of. They're not a single. These ransomware gangs aren't a single organization. They're businesses that contract with other businesses and so forth, but they're too big to hide. So you wouldn't have them here because we'd prosecute them. But at the same time...
And sorry, Kim, can I just understand something? Because I've got an image of two kids upstairs in their bedroom. This is not what this is.
No, that's one of the great myths of cybersecurity. I mean, War Games is a fantastic movie, but it's actually very damaging for the public understanding of cybersecurity. Suburban teenagers in Chicago bedrooms cannot start nuclear wars online. I'm pretty sure of that. I mean, I'll never say never, but I'm pretty sure of that, right? But so they're businesses, and they're illegal businesses. So if they were here, they wouldn't be allowed to operate. Similarly, but in a sense, until now, and arguably still, they haven't been a problem for the Russian state. Clever people making money. They're harassing the West, but they're not causing egregious harm, or they weren't until recently. They were extorting rich corporate executives, often in America, France, a bit in the UK, for money, but they weren't causing real harm. At the minute, some people think, and it's too early to tell, some people think the ransomware crowd are overreaching because they're now causing serious problems. I mean, a year ago, Dave, Martina, and I might have been talking about ransomware, but you wouldn't have been interested, James, no disrespect. Now it's a paragraph of a G7 communique on top of the agenda for the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva. And Biden understands the distinction between Russian state-sponsored cyber aggression, which is actually quite controlled quite a lot of the time, versus this criminality.
And can you just understand what's happened? Because as I was sort of giving that rather kind of clumsy and ignorant introduction to things, Tim Rawlins in the chat said, "Oh dear, James, you've missed this kind of rising, acceleration in cybercrime." But I see, for example, Tom Hurd's here, and I was in a conversation with him the other day where he said exactly what you just said, that sort of out of nowhere, cyber ransomware earned its own paragraph in the G7 communique. So there's been a step change here, and I don't quite understand why, because it's not clear that there's been a technological change.
Obviously, it's because I left government, but more seriously, so I sometimes think, ransomware, it's really hard to get quantitative data on it because you don't have to report payments, you don't have to report breaches. So, hard data is hard to come by. But if you could, I suspect it would look like, those graphs of the population of the world, sort of slow and steady rise to about 1800, and then it goes up like that. I suspect ransomware would look a bit like that. And the point of the 1800 point is sort of late 2019. So I'm also in government, but and it gets more acute. And why is that? It's because a bunch of things became, it's a bit like an economic boom in a particular industry. It became clearer and clearer this was the really profitable way of making money out of cybercrime. It's not, as I think Dave has said before, it's not about monetizing data so much anymore. And the reason it's so difficult, and we shouldn't despair because we get solutions, but I think about national security risk or just any other risk. Normally when you're dealing with a risk, there's a bunch of things that work in either direction. Some favor you as the defender and some favor the attacker, and you try and shift the dial mostly in your favor. At the minute, right now, literally everything favors the attacker. They've got a safe operating haven in Russia. They know how to exploit structural, long-standing weaknesses in Western cybersecurity. The money flows too easily. All of those things work in favor of the attacker, and basically nothing's working in our favor at the minute. And so it's a unique set of circumstances that mean that everyone's flocking to this. And so we've got to shift some of those things.
Well, Kieran, I want to come back on that because part of the nature of this conversation is the idea of trying to understand what can people in business, CEOs in particular, do. In fact, when we thought about this series of responsible leadership with Teneo, which has been our partnership in it, part of the question was, we know what the problem is, actually what can a person do, and specifically the responsibility of a CEO. Do you pay? Is that good for the business? Not necessarily good for national security, not necessarily good for the landscape of cyber. So I want to make sure we get into that. But Martina King, can I bring you in if I might? Because I think, Martina, one of the things about this that makes it so abstract is, if you're not a specialist, you probably don't know solar winds, you probably don't know Colonial Pipeline, you may not have followed this co-op story. Is there a moment you think this is coming where, in a way that's not been the case so far, it affects us as individuals, it affects us as consumers? Oh, sorry, you're muted, forgive me.
There you are. Okay. Yeah, sorry, I thought you had control of that, but I've got control of it. Well, good evening, and it's really great to be part of this discussion. And this is my first one of the think tanks, so I'm delighted to be able to make a contribution. Certainly, the way we're looking at the problem at Featurespace is typically from a fraud or an anti-money laundering position. So. And it is very much from that consumer angle. So I think you were making the point about, the cyber criminals not necessarily being individuals who are working in their bedrooms. With the fraud problem, you've got a whole range of different types of people, and where the bad actors are is in a variety of different countries. So very often with cyber, we hear that there are people operating from certain countries. With fraud, it's much harder. We don't necessarily know, we can't pinpoint certain geographies and say all the fraud is taking place from here. We have a lot of fraud that takes place in the UK. In fact, there's just some stats out today. In the first half of last year, Brits have lost over £1 billion of fraud in the first 6 months of in the first 6 months of this year, 2021. So we can see that there's a huge amount of loss that's taken place, and it is exactly the type of calls coming back to this point, which is these are really established organizations. They make huge amounts of money. They've got large workforces. They hire graduates. They recruit for graduates on the internet. They come in, and then you get those typical scams where we've all had them. The telephone calls that come through, it's BT on the telephone. There's something wrong with your broadband. Give me access to your laptop. And as soon as you do that, then the criminals have access to your behavior. They can work out what your passwords are. They can take over your laptop. They can get access to your banking details, et cetera, et cetera. So the other side of the criminal activity, the truth is that for the large banks, so many of them actually hold the liability of loss.
Yeah.
They're leaking huge amounts of money. So is this a boardroom issue? Absolutely, it's a boardroom issue, and the CEOs are worried about it. But it's been an issue for a very long time in business, and they have budgets and hundreds of people and multi-millions of pounds that they invest every year trying to beat the criminals.
And I suppose the question is whether or not, and I know, Martina, that FeatureSpace, and you work with a bunch of kind of banks and financial services companies. Yeah. I suppose what's happened in the internet age so far, in the age of digital banking so far, is that banks have worn a certain degree of fraud as part of the cost of doing business online. And the question is whether or not we're at a moment, we're about to see things tip over, where those banks say, and I was talking to the chairman of one of the British banks recently, who said, look, we're getting to the point where this is just inching up higher and higher and higher as a monthly cost of doing business. Sooner or later, it's going to become unaffordable, and we're going to have to stop allowing a level of criminality that's infecting our banking system. I wonder whether or not you see that, and whether or not it's actually possible now, or it's endemic.
Yeah, yes, and I mean, if we go back to the old days of copying the credit card, it's still credit card that is the biggest loss to society. Particularly in the US, it's enormous, but also here in the UK. And then scams, I think it's something like 45% of the loss, fraud loss, is credit card, and then scams is high up on the list then at 37%. So this is a, if you like, the tactics of the criminals haven't changed. We saw a big shift and an enormous increase during the COVID crisis. Hooray, we're nearly out the other side of it in the UK. We can all go back to our offices. But, what we've, on the 23rd of March last year, if we look at how we were using our credit cards, always in the data, there was a combination of card present and card not present data. And everybody, of course, shifted to card not present. And what we've seen for the many years that we've been working has been the huge shift in transaction flow to digital. And as you mentioned earlier, kind of we're not going to be using cash any longer. All of our transactions currently are online, and so it's the protection of that the banks are working really hard. They've got this digital transformation that they're all going through. All of the payment flow is now real time. And then they've got a technological challenge that's taking place, and the criminals are really getting in on the back of those shifts that are taking place.
Martina, thanks. I'm going to ask Dave Palmer, if I can, just to help us through a little bit, if you like, a bit the recent history, Dave, and a bit the sort of what's coming next in the next 18 months. Because, I said at the beginning, you've been kind enough to come to one of our think-ins in our newsroom. I think when we talked about that, we talked a lot about individual security and data, right? And it feels like another age. It feels like we were talking about password protection and data scrapes. It looks to me now as though you're talking about what Kieran described, companies being held hostage, and as a result, potentially the infrastructure of our economy, even our kind of towns and cities and way of life being held hostage. Is something shifting in the way in which this cybercrime works? And where do you think it goes from here?
Absolutely, it's a shift, and partly it's Martina's fault. So one of the things that has happened is a wide variety of technologies, including Martina's, has come into the banks, is spotting fraud, is making things like a lost credit card number for Dave Palmer of very low value to a criminal. And going after personal data, going after personal banking details is far less profitable than it would have been when we last spent time together a few years ago. Another thing that's been a real success is your average smartphone that you can go and buy from the shop won't just have cutting edge cybersecurity built into it. It will have behavioral nudges that continually, frankly, make your life difficult unless you start using them in a secure way. So whether it's fingerprint readers, whether it's face recognition devices, whether it's you try and type in a rubbish password into a new website and it says, whoa, wait a minute, James, how about this indecipherable 32-digit password? Our consumer devices and in general, most of the interactions we have as consumers are geared towards us as individuals operating in a secure way. And as the low-hanging fruit of citizens around the world has started to dry up, combined with Kieran's point that there is a safe harbor in parts of the world for industrial scale cyber criminality, and the rise of cryptocurrencies making untraceable money easy to move around. I think someone has made that comment in the chat that was speeding past, means you're far better off going up for what the industry frequently calls whales, so go whaling after big targets in the corporate sector than you are as individuals kicking around. And so what we're seeing is a shift. The money's better, the money's easier in those big corporate targets. But partly it's because of the successes we've had as an industry over the last 5 years.
So okay, so where does that leave you then, Dave? Because listening to this, I would say, okay, we've moved out of the age of cyber pickpockets into an industrialized age of cybercrime. At the moment, it seems as though we're in the ransom business. We're holding companies hostage. That is the phase we're in.
Yeah.
Where do you think it goes next?
I like to be an optimist most of the time. And I'd like to be here too. Let's see if it works, and maybe Kieran or the audience wants to disagree. I think I agree with Kieran entirely that the ransom business has become too bold and they're picking too severe a target for them to become a low-level issue for major governments and the international community as a whole. And I think there does come a point where you, forgive the analogy, poke the bear hard enough that the international community will start to take stronger and stronger diplomatic stances, stronger and stronger international law enforcement collaboration. And my optimistic hope is the egregious attacks that we've seen from ransomware, whether it's on critical national infrastructure or health services or supermarkets and the like, become enough to force international collaboration and diplomacy to really start driving in on those that harbor the criminals and the mechanisms that exist within the international banking system for them turning the cryptocurrency into real money. And as that happens, then hopefully these sorts of things start to dry up.
All right, well, can we take a few of those things in turn, Dave? I want to just bring in David Smith, who made the point in the chat about crypto and the extent to which, to your point, Kieran, that crypto or the circumstances are at the moment in favor of the cyber criminals. You made the point about crypto, making all of that easier.
Yeah, so I mean, this is what I've heard, and I have had, so one thing in just listening to what everybody has said, I would say to folk, don't focus just on all the super large organizations. I work for a charity. I'm not authorized to talk on their behalf, so I won't tell you who that charity is, but we're a small to medium sized organization, and we do focus on cybersecurity. I know of some fellow colleague charities that have suffered directly and egregiously from ransomware attacks and are digging out from under that actually this year. So I think that the thing that I observe is what seems to make that possible is the fact that if you were to do this kind of attack anywhere else, the Rozzers would find you, they'd find the money trace. But if you're using cryptocurrencies, right, there's no way of tracing where that money goes. So it's very, very easy to scale this out and go after all sorts of targets basically with impunity.
Can I, David, I just want to put that to Kieran, if I might. Kieran, two separate questions really. Firstly, can I just address David's point about whether or not cryptocurrency enables or disables the prospect of law enforcement catching the cyber criminals? Because I thought one of the elements of the colonial pipeline story was that crypto had helped them at least trace back some of the ransom that had been paid.
Well, I mean, they got some of it back, actually, in a rather devalued form, but that was more to do with Elon Musk's tweets, wiping billions off the value of cryptocurrency than anything else. Also, I mean, it was a very interesting and commendable FBI operation to get some of the ransom back, because at least it showed some of the criminals that they couldn't act with impunity. But I think it's gone too far to say that that it was helping. It didn't help law enforcement. It was an operation to retrieve money rather than disrupt the criminals. And also, whilst it was a tactical signal to the criminals that, look, you can't act with complete impunity. The other thing is, it's not really a scalable operation. The FBI, even the FBI don't have the resources to go after every cryptocurrency illicit transaction, and also the criminals in this case made some technical mistakes, which others then won't make as a result. So it's not a strategic solution. It was quite a cool operation, but not a strategic solution. So ultimately, David Smith's right on both his points. One is, let's not forget the smaller organizations. I mean, today's the Swedish co-op, if we can call a much more complicated operation the Swedish co-op incident for sake of brevity. The overall impact of it as time moves on is turning out to be less headline grabbing than we might have thought on Friday or Saturday. But one of the reasons that is quite a lot of the victims are small and they don't really have a voice. And so I completely sympathize with the point he made about charities. The point about cryptocurrency, I'm not an expert on cryptocurrency, and I try not to opine about things that I don't really understand. So, but in terms of its interaction with this problem, it has greatly facilitated the expansion of ransomware attacks. Ransomware predates cryptocurrencies, or certainly, the first ransomware attacks in their modern form were in dollars, but they weren't on the same scale. So it's enabled the growth of ransomware, but it's not completely dependent on it. It's a complex issue. So the US government, the US Treasury has had a draft rule since December last year. In other words, it's out for consultation. It's not implemented yet. Called a Know Your Customer rule. So you'd have to you'd have to be able to sort of verify if you wanted to receive more than $10,000 that you sort of knew where it was going and where it was coming from. And some people think that will disrupt could disrupt the flow of money. Others think that it'll just be easy to evade. So what I'd like to see in all of this, I'm not arrogant enough to say, there's a really simple solution here, whether it's banning ransom payments, or I think there's a case for it, or whether it's, really tightly regulating cryptocurrencies. What I would like to see is just more government effort, both here in the US and actually in coordination. The G7 had a paragraph on ransomware. Why not have a G7 working group on illicit money and ransomware, or get the Financial Action Task Force or something to just do some papers and say, look, here is the best way of, controlling cryptocurrency's role in this racket without completely crippling cryptocurrencies. If you don't want to do that, here's the most efficacious way of the most effective potential way of limiting payments. Whether that's transparency requirement or a ban, whatever it is. I do think we just need to up our effort on this.
So, Kieran, can I just ask you, just to follow up on that point, and I'm going to come to Tom Hurd if I might, just because he makes a point about hacking and cybercrime in Russia. Kieran, you just said something in passing there, which is there are no rules on banning ransom payments, although I think there's a case for it. I think any business would feeling completely bewildered right now about what to do in the event that they were the victim of a ransomware attack, i.e., what's the legal thing that they can do, what's the ethical thing that they can do, and practically speaking, what's the most expedient thing they can do. So can you just talk through the arguments around banning ransomware, ransom payments?
So the legal thing's easy. You can pay pretty much any kind of reward you can pay. Yeah. And you don't have to tell anybody. Unless there's some violation of GDPR, which in some ransomware attacks there are and some there aren't, but you can pay. So that's simple. The practicalities are you can hire somebody to help you pay. There are now growing professional negotiators and so forth, because, for a start, your systems may be crippled, so you may not have access to your money. You probably don't want to ring up a bank and say, could you get me $10 million of Bitcoin and transfer it to some Russian criminals, because banks tend to be a bit, reticent about that sort of thing. So there are professional services. So the ethics, like, I'm not going to try and keep you going for the rest of the call, because other people have more interesting things to say. It's really tough. And one of the things you say about people not having a clue, this is the real dilemma. In a sense, particularly in the US, I think we're privatizing a national security risk. We're leaving it to business executives to take these huge decisions. So, if you contrast, say, an attack on the Irish healthcare system, which we've had, an attack on an entire national healthcare system, at least as was the case when the UK NHS got hit in 2017. It was the Prime Minister in 2017, it was the Taoiseach in 2021. They take the decisions on how we're going to respond to it. If you hit a US hospital, it's the equivalent of Dr. Cuddy in House. It's the chief executive of the hospital who takes the decision. So there's this asymmetry between a national security risk and a threat to patient care with the way the response works, and we need to think that through. Then you get into ethics. What are the ethics for Kaseya today? All their customers are suffering because of Kaseya, not because of anything the customers did. So should they pay the big ransom, the $70 million? Some people are saying they should. I don't think they should. If a business is going to go out of business because of the ransom, should they pay? I can understand that. Having said all that, the previous Revel operation, the meat plant, the meat company, the meat company put out a statement saying that they paid an $11 million ransom, which obviously was going to encourage Revel to come back for more. And they said, our systems weren't badly disrupted. No data was exfiltrated, so we weren't going to be at risk from blackmail about data releases. But we were worried about some unspecified potential harm to customers, so we paid. That, in my view, is very, very, very questionable. To put it mildly, and I would have thought it is not beyond the wit of our species to frame a set of regulatory law to prevent that sort of payment. Because we all know what it incentivizes, and it just doesn't just incentivize more ransomware. This incentivizes the criminal state in Russia, which does an awful lot of all the bad things. People trafficking. It's all tied up in this horrible ecosystem we have to try and break. So the ethics of this are complicated, but at the same time, it is not for private corporations to make these ethical judgments on their own. Governments need to confront the issue.
And as things stand, there's no country in the world that can prosecute a company for making the payment.
So as far as I know, you can always be proved wrong. In the UK, it's not. In the UK, the UK always took a tough line on terrorist kidnapping payment. So as I understand it, theoretically, if a terrorist group took up ransomware, you couldn't pay them because if they're a prescribed terrorist risk. In the US, the US Treasury have got this massive list of sanctioned entities that have, annoyed or violated US interests in some way. And the US issued a warning around Christmas time, I think, saying if you pay ransom to companies that are on the US sanctions list, to entities that are on the US sanctions list, you may be committing an offense. But those are legacies of other laws, if you know what I mean. And in a sense, why should I not be allowed, if I'm being ransomed and my business is at risk, but if the terrorist group, I can't pay them. But if it's what we, in my native Northern Ireland in the 1980s, used to call ordinary decent criminals, you can. It doesn't make any sense. How are you supposed to check, if you're an American company, how are you supposed to check, oh, am I being ransomed by somebody on the sanctions list? It's illogical.
I very much appreciate the use of the new term of the ordinary decent criminals. I'm going to come to them in a moment. Dave, I'm going to come back to you. I just want to bring in Tom Hurd because he made this point about the increase in cyber in Russia. Tom, is your point that you think that this traffic is going both ways, or do the Russians think this traffic is going both ways?
Well, it's really, I'd be very interested in people's views, but there are quite a lot of conflicting messages at the moment. So you've got the Russians who've said for a long time they want to have a discussion on cyber. Now, that means something slightly different to them than it does to us, because they see cybersecurity as part of a subset of actually information security and information sovereignty. So they don't put it in a neat box. They see it as something that's linked as much to their ability to protect or to monitor any content inside their country. So, social media, the internet, and cybersecurity is just a subset of that. So they do look at it differently, but they have said for a long time they want to talk. Then you've got the fact that we had this G7 statement and then the Biden-Putin summit. Biden says there are 16 areas that are a no-go area. We're kind of, I suspect Biden's hardly even out of self-isolation. We've already straight into some pretty big cyber attacks coming out of Russia. And then you've got Putin, who, is on record of saying that cyber attacks, cybercrime in Russia is up 350%. He even told the FSB, so their equivalent of kind of MI5++, that they needed to do more on cybersecurity in February. And so, I just wondered, Kieran, from your perspective or from others, what you think was the art of the possible with the Russians? Because if they're not going to play, we know there's a different playbook for dealing with terrorists who put us at physical risk. When do we move the dial and start going after some of the gangs?
And Tom, can I just press on that 1 second? Because I know we've talked about this before, but Kieran started off saying, look, these are not kids upstairs in their bedrooms. These are kind of industrially organized operations. Presumably, and for people who don't know, Tom Hurd used to run the Office for Counterterrorism. Tom, presumably, it's possible to track who these people are and where they are. So if you wanted to take the same approach to counter cyber as you took to counterterrorism, i.e. the ability to use force, it's possible to identify these targets.
It's theoretically possible, of course. They live on this planet. Money is, at some stage, hits the physical domain. So theoretically it's possible. Of course, it's a massive policy decision and technically incredibly difficult to get at these people. So I wouldn't underplay how difficult it would be to go after them within the Russian state. But it's theoretically possible. So it's not off the table, particularly, if you got to a point where, a cyber attack led to the deaths of, many, many people. I think governments were being asked, what else was in the locker?
Kieran, I'm just going to, forgive me, I'm just going to press the two of you just to follow that through, is because, as Tom said, that is a big policy decision, whether or not you use lethal force against cyber criminals that do endanger the lives of your citizens.
So, I mean, I'm well short of that position. I mean, for all sorts of reasons. And one is, of course, it is one thing to do, that sort of, frankly, outside of the state of declared conflict, that sort of operation against terrorists operating in some sort of stateless place and another, doing it in the sovereign territory of a P5 member, as in the Russian Federation. But also, I mean, just more practically and more prosaically, there are important differences between what we're talking about here. So, the US have had something called Cyber Command, a branch of the US military, since 2009. The UK has got a National Cyber Force since 2020, although it's a codification of existing things. And their job isn't to go around, frankly, killing people. Their job is to do what they might call cyber effects operations. And some of those operations could be destroying the infrastructure or disabling or somehow disrupting the digital infrastructure used by the hackers. And law enforcement and the FBI in particular can lead and have led international coalitions of efforts. So there's this, to get jargonistic, there was the Emotet botnet, this huge sort of.
Can you just say it again?
What is it? Dave will say, is it Emotet or Emotet? EMOTET. So it was this massive sort of web of malign digital infrastructure used by cyber criminals, and particularly these sorts of guys. And there's a very good law enforcement operation and law enforcement and intelligence, and probably, although they don't disclose this sort of thing, Cyber Command type of operation to take it down earlier this year. Now, this would be, it's more, this is more replicable than, say, the cryptocurrency recovery operation that you and I talked about earlier, James. But again, you think, and it's very, it's potentially useful. to disrupt some of them. I think it would be what you might call a super tactical solution rather than a strategic one. I think you still have to get at the root causes. So just to go back to something, but you can and should do these sorts of things. You need to be really careful, because the last thing we want to do is for one of these one of these operations that we might do is to go accidentally viral and start to disrupt all sorts of networks of innocent people and companies. And you do have to really, really take care of that, because it's not like dropping a bomb, or at least it, if there's a physical ending to that operation, these things can spiral out of control. But there is something, and Dave Palmer and I were touching on this, and there is something about trying to change the calculation for the Russian state. I mean, Paul alluded to the fact that Russia does have a cybercrime problem of its own. It just doesn't advertise it. And the Irish healthcare case is fascinating, because Ireland did not pay. The Irish government is not engaged in a campaign of systematic lying to the world. They did not pay. They didn't suffer more detriment, actually, than plenty of organizations who did, because if you pay, you buy a key, decryption key, but it's not a magic switch back on key. Your networks are damaged by the attack, and it takes time to get back. But the criminals seem to have been pressurized by somebody to giving the key to the Irish government for free. Because clearly some people somewhere, it could have been all the ransomware criminals who didn't like the publicity and unwelcome attention, and actually perhaps had a moral objection to attacking hospitals. Some of them, this is a business for them, and they may not want to be in this business, or it could have been parts of the Russian state saying, look, you can hack American companies all you want, but if you start disrupting the national healthcare system of EU member states, you're not going to be allowed to operate anymore. There is something about trying to change the calculation for the Russian regime to make this a problem for them, rather than a sort of tolerable or even advantageous thing to do to harbor them. So that plus, the operations to disrupt them, I think, are more realistic options than sort of military type activity.
I mean, we are deep here, aren't we, Kieran, in the world of cyber criminals who are having, crisis of conscience. I mean, it's sort of an amazing thought that were the case. I want to, if I can, Dave, just ask you to do something which just to help us go a little more slowly, which is, what happens when a ransomware attack actually happens? So can you just explain to us? I mean, I get excited. I wrote that down. Emotet, botnet. I mean, terrific. But actually, just really practically, if you're a business in the way in which David described, what happens? What's happened to your company when a ransomware attack happens? How do they do it? And what kind of notification do you get? I mean, just talk us through the whole process, if you would.
Be delighted to. And I think the fun bit at the end is some tough decisions that maybe the CEO and the board have to work their way through, because they have other ethical issues in addition to the ones we've touched on. First thing to say is many of these groups, and Kieran alluded to it, are not acting independently. So if someone decides, I'm going to set up in cyber crime, I've got some certain victims in mind, or what have you, and I'd like the tools to be able to do it. They will likely go to a middleman or a marketplace where they will rent or buy the tools for which they want to conduct the operation. And they might stitch together a variety of tools from different places, but they're certainly not writing millions of lines of code from scratch. And you'll find all sorts of services available in these marketplaces. You'll have encryption experts, and you'll have payment experts and cryptocurrency people. And many of the tools or victim lists might have a money-back guarantee, which seems crazy. By the way, there is also a 24/7 call center if you get stuck using it. This is a material industry rather than some shady, like rubbish-looking page that you might imagine. And some of those marketplaces will even send the attack for you, or help write the aggressive email that, or the enticing email that will be sent to the victims. And typically they're sent en masse. So rarely are they going to pick off people one at a time. Most of the attacks are indiscriminate.
And just answer one thing. So these are go-betweens who act on behalf of the attacker in communication with the victim of the ransomware attack.
They probably won't, the person will probably do the communication themselves, but the attack tools, the software that does the damage, perhaps the infrastructure by which the attack is hosted before it's downloaded to the victim, all of that technical stuff could well come from middlemen. Yeah, seems mind-blowing, doesn't it?
So let's say you're, as David Smith described, you're running a small, medium-sized business. You're on the end of a ransomware attack. What happens then?
Things will just suddenly start breaking, and to begin with, you'll think that you're having an IT issue, and then you'll think the internet is down, and then you'll start getting an incoherent set of stories. All of that never believe the first reports from battle type thing will feel true at this moment. But what will start to become apparent is there are messages popping up on people's laptops that have a ransom notice on them. You've been attacked by blah, 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 some analogy, maybe some movie reference, probably some gloating, and then likely some threats of what will happen if you don't pay the ransom, and then some either details or links to web pages that will tell you how to go and pay the ransom. And that's not standardized, they will vary. One of the things that's interesting about the Co-op case is that the ransom has been requested in Bitcoin, and that's not normal for REvil. They normally deal in Monero. So maybe some clues there that this is people acting as middlemen or what have you. But fundamentally, you'll end up with a place where quite possibly, as a senior member of this organization, you haven't got a phone book anymore. You don't know what the IT people's phone number is because you've never had to call them before. You can't send them an email. Your laptop's broken. You can't look them up on your intranet. All of that stuff you took for granted is gone. And you're probably ringing your direct reports in the hope that someone out of the social graph of people knows the head of IT's phone number or the head of security's phone number. And that's not, to be honest, that's a very common feeling of chaos that you will have potentially for hours in sorting out what happens next. Now, I think this is one of the exciting dilemmas that comes next. So sometimes, quite frequently, you find the HQ's laptops aren't working, the payment systems are broken, but actually the thing that my business does still works. And now you have a decision of, if I can't charge anyone for it, should I continue delivering my underlying business service? Now, I'm not going to name people that we know who have made what I think is the wrong decision on this, but naming someone I believe made the right decision would be the San Francisco Light Railway, who lost the ability to take payments across the entirety of their rail network. So they ran the railway for free for Kira might know specifically the details. I think it was about a week that they ran the railway for free while they rebuilt their payment infrastructure and the laptops in the head office. And I think that's, history will see them on the right side of justice. But some of in fact, at least one of the examples we've used tonight, they were able to deliver their service, but they weren't able to take payments anymore. And they decided, rather than potentially lose revenue, they would simply stop delivering their service to customers. And what a fascinating dilemma we go through as business or organizational leaders if we have to choose between that.
And Dave, can you just answer the question then? So I appreciate the point Kieran made earlier, which is you can pay. What I don't understand is if you're the chief executive of a company and then you face that choice, if you do pay and don't tell the state, are you doing something that's in the interest of your potentially colleagues, customers, and shareholders, but actually is damaging to the national security interests of your country?
Kieran's nodding vigorously. Yes, but that doesn't mean that is the wrong decision. So if your job is treating cancer patients and you can't treat cancer patients at the moment, then in the nicest possible way, Kieran's new colleague at the NCSC might be grumpy with us for paying the ransom and furthering the problem the state has. But fundamentally, you have a duty of care to start getting treatment back to those people. Or if you are failing to deliver.
Let's assume as though it's not as easily tug on the heartstrings case, right? Let's assume that it's actually exactly as I say. It's kind of, let's keep our people in work, let's keep our customers happy, let's make sure our shareholders don't lose money, right? In that circumstance, let's say that the CEO says, no, I'm going to take a decision on behalf of the common good, the country. What confidence do I have that in kind of compensation or in response to that, the country itself will successfully prosecute the cyber criminals?
Well, you shouldn't take any, but that doesn't mean that you're not doing the right thing. I don't think that will be the narrative. I think most people just innately will not want to reward criminals for what they've done to you, that will feel very emotionally visceral and raw. Yeah. But what you'll be weighing up is, you'll be talking to your IT people and saying, how bloody long is it going to be if we have to rebuild it from scratch? Right. And if they've got quite a short answer to that, then you may well be up for taking the pain. Mm-hmm. You have to bear in mind, and something we haven't touched on very much is, almost certainly during the ransomware incident, a load of your data was stolen. And so another sort of Damocles that will be hanging over your head is, they will be drip feeding you bits of your data and say, hey, James, here are some of the emails you sent to your kids last month. I've got all your data. Do you want all of that to be put on a public website, et cetera, et cetera? So there will be lots of, this is an emotional scam. It's deliberate, it's impactful, it's high intensity, and anything the criminals can do to turn up the ante on you in order to try and make a decision to pay them, they will do. But if you know you can recover, then that is the best thing to do, for the society.
Dave, I'm doing a completely lousy job of keeping hold of time here, partly because it's so interesting. I saw Jane Hunt had made this really interesting point about the way in which we respect, we handle IT and our expectations of IT in terms of safety and security, which I just recommend people take a look at. I'm also struck by how clear Robert Campbell has been in response to the question, what expectations should you have the government is going to go after the cyber criminals successfully, to which I noticed that Robert just said none. I don't know whether, Robert, you've had any experience of this, but that seems to me. Yeah, Robert, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so my background is running what's traditionally known as a reseller in software information security for the last 25 years. I was also a founding director of the Northeast Fraud Forum, which was an organization, I'm no longer involved in that. But it's to try and teach people about what the fraud opportunities are and what to do about it. And my kind of classic barroom story is about working and doing a security review for one of the major stockbrokers in London. And at the time, we were doing with things like laptop encryption and data encryption to prevent stolen laptops leaking information. And I had one of the IT guys come to me and said, look, the finance director's just told me to remove this stuff because it's a pain in the backside. And I said, well, so one of the first things we've got to do to make this stuff stick is to go to the board and say, really, you need to all do this, because you can't go around and bully the IT staff to do something, to undo what we're trying to do. Yeah. So before I proceeded any further, I got them to sign a document which I could give to all the IT staff to say, you cannot ask me to remove the stuff, I've got to do that. Mm-hmm. The question fundamentally comes down to two things. One is the perception of people about how valuable it is. And I think that's changed over the 15 years. Sure, this was kind of 15 years ago. But still, the average Joe in the street and the average organization in SMEs in particular don't see the value until it actually happens. Yeah. And when it comes down to it, they report it to the fraud action, which is down in London, part run by the City of London Police Force. And stuff just disappears into that as a black hole. So you can report fraud all you like, day after day after day after day, and fundamentally, you don't even get any feedback as to whether that's been recognised or not. You don't get stuff back. It's one of the reasons I pulled out of the NEF. It's just handled. And when we talk about, when I was at a conference, we were talking about how do you make fraud action service or the police force in your area take action against anything, often the answer is, unless you're big enough and it looks as though it's going to hurt huge numbers of people, nothing happens.
Yeah.
The only other way to do it is to do it yourself
Mm-hmm.
and actually take civil action out against somebody. Well, nobody's got any time for that.
Yeah, all the capabilities. Robert, thank you. I mean, I think it's a, actually the way you describe it, you can understand, Dave, why when this problem hits a CEO, you feel kind of frozen. It's an incredibly difficult set of choices. Martina, if I might, I just wanted to give you the last word because it feels to me as though we've gone full circle here, which is we started out talking about kind of industrial ransomware attacks. We heard your point about how far this is tipping into consumer lives, and then we got back into those big corporate cases. But where do you think this goes next in terms of us as citizens? Is it going to be disruption to our lives rather than data breaches? Is it going to add to a sense of insecurity? How do you think these things, which at the moment, frankly, sit in the pages of the FT or halfway down a news bulletin now and again, is going to begin to impact our own lives and our own sense of confidence online?
Yeah, well, I think it's been a fascinating debate, and I'd just like to come at it answering your question, first of all, from the boardroom, which is, I'm less involved in the cyber side, but far more involved in the fraud side. And the fraud issue has been an issue for a very long time. And as we said before, it's just a price of doing business and companies budget for fraud loss. I wonder, listening to this discussion, if this, because we can't beat the criminals. I mean, that's ultimately the question that you posed us. We can't beat them. So therefore, if we can't beat them, we're going to have to just try and make sure that I've seen the point about insurance, but we're going to have to budget for these losses. I think another thing that's changed has been as business leaders, we've all been terrified of the reputational damage and also of the fines that we get as a result of not actually managing this well enough. So maybe the business leaders can be given a bit of a break here, which is we are trying to do the best we possibly can to fight the criminals, but fining us is not necessarily the right thing. And coming back to your point about reputation earlier, maybe if it isn't such a big story any longer, then we don't have to worry about our reputations. We can then worry more about fighting the crime. And then I think it comes to answer your question then about the consumer. Dave, you said earlier that maybe fraud is less of a problem, and so it's a lower hanging fruit to go after the ransomwares. But actually, what we learned through COVID is that the consumer is still incredibly naive and very vulnerable and will hand over all of their personal information. So I think ultimately what we've got to do is still educate ourselves and try and help people understand that there are some very simple things we can do to stop giving criminals our private information.
Well, I should say, I feel bad because there's so many people. I said I'm trying to come to Tim Rawlins, I didn't get the chance. I see Gordon Carrera, my old BBC colleague, is here. We didn't get the chance to do all of these conversations, and I mentioned Jane Hunt. If you've not been sort of thinking before, the aim is to try and come away with a better informed point of view. And at least in that sense, we seem to have got somewhere, because I suppose I come away much, much clearer with this idea of how the world has moved from consumer fraud to what feels to me like systemic cybercrime. And what we don't know yet is how those systemic attacks will actually impact the infrastructure of our way of life. They're clearly impacting the infrastructure of businesses, whether it's through their software systems or their supply chains. We're beginning to see that. What we haven't quite seen yet is the impact that could have on whole systems of ways of working and ways of living. But you can't help suspect that may yet come. The thing that's interesting, and I suppose journalistically we're going to try and do and take from this, is just listening to everyone this evening. It feels as though there is an incredibly revealing story at some point to tell that traces the cyber criminals, the ransomware attackers, that gives you a sense of who they are, that busts that myth of the kids upstairs, takes it through into the company system, and then through the culture of the company and the questions that those executives need to ask themselves, and as you say, Martina, the questions that the board needs to ask the management. And then, if you like, that fork in the road where, you know, to Dave's point, you've got to choose what you're doing for your citizens versus what you're doing for your country, and then ultimately takes it through cybercrime, company, citizen to the state. Either the state acting blind, not able to see what the company's done, or informed, following up and seeking to prosecute either the individual criminal or the state that harbors it. And if you could follow one case of this, one ransomware all the way through, we might get to something that feels like more understanding of what still seems like a marginal and shadowy world, but feels like it's going to be still shadowy, but less and less marginal. So thank you for helping us sort of frame at least what we need to do next. It's been an open news meeting that I suppose has given us just a glimpse of the scale of this, and also a very good sense of who we need to call when we want to understand this, we hope, only journalistically. Kieran Martin, Martina King, Dave Palmer, thank you very much. Sorry we're not together in person, but hope we can do this again in the future. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a very good evening.